opens lines for bishops and queen, seizing central territory for dynamic piece play. Instantly building central tension, this gambit opens paths for counterplay. Developing the knight to f3, a flexible piece, immediately challenges black's central pawn structure and prepares for queenside castling, aiming for rapid king safety. Establishing a solid pawn chain, black fortifies the center while preparing to develop their pieces for a strategic battle ahead. Opening the center invites a sharp battle, immediately challenging black's pawn structure. Opens the center and contests central space, offering a dynamic pawn structure where tactical possibilities quickly emerge. Recapturing the pawn opens central lines, allowing knights to quickly join the fray and contest the king's safety. Developing the knight efficiently strikes at the center, initiating immediate counterplay and preparing for castling. A tactical pivot, solidifying central influence while preparing rapid development and eyeing queenside expansion options. Preparing a queenside expansion, this subtle maneuver aims to secure territory and potentially unleash a pawn storm. Safeguarding the king's immediate vicinity from potential knight or bishop invasions down the g-file proves a prudent, albeit passive, choice, preparing for future kingside development without immediately challenging black's robust central pawn structure. Unleashing the dragon's lair, g6 initiates a fianchetto, aiming to anchor the bishop on the long diagonal and potentially disrupt white's central ambitions by creating a pawn chain. Boldly seizing central space, this pawn thrust aggressively challenges black's kingside structure, aiming to pry open lines for attack while potentially weakening white's own king's safety. Developing the bishop to this active square prepares to challenge white's aggressive pawn thrust on the kingside, aiming to leverage the bishop's long-range influence and potentially create attacking opportunities along the dark squares. Casting a watchful eye over the queenside, the bishop now aims to secure the kingside dark squares, a subtle but important preparatory step to potentially launch an attack down the kingside or support pawn advances. Securing the monarch amid the arising pawn storm on the kingside, this castling maneuver effectively shelters the king and prepares for potential counterplay on the queenside by unblocking the rook. Anchoring the queen here begins a subtle maneuver to support a kingside pawn storm, aiming to dismantle black's fianchettoed structure and create attacking chances. Initiating a queenside expansion, this thrust aims to disrupt white's spatial advantage on the kingside and potentially open lines for black's pieces, though it requires careful calculation to avoid creating weaknesses. Bringing the bishop back to its diagonal, 10. bg2 reinforces the central dark squares, a subtle preparation for potential pawn pushes on the kingside or a more solid defense against black's ambitious queenside expansion. The bishop now guards the g-pawn and eyes the long diagonal, aiming to restrict the free movement of black's pieces on that side of the board while also preparing for castling. This bishop repositioning creates a dynamic tension, as white simultaneously solidifies their structure and maintains a watchful eye on the unfolding battle. Developing the bishop to the queenside establishes a strong diagonal presence, eyeing the center and preparing to contest the dark squares along the b7h1 diagonal. It also offers prophylaxis against any potential knight incursions on c4, while keeping the pawn structure flexible for future pawn pushes on the queenside. A strategic retreat, this pawn advance curbs black's queenside ambitions by denying the b4 square, a crucial outpost for a knight or bishop, while simultaneously preparing for a potential future b4 pawn push itself, thereby opening a diagonal for the queen or a file for a rook. Securing the knight's central influence and preparing its sortie to a more active square demonstrates a commendable understanding of piece development within this sharp Sicilian Najdorf structure. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, white boldly ventures g5, aiming to pry open lines and accelerate the attack against black's castled king. Shifting the knight to the edge offers a fresh perspective, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn thrust and potentially find active squares on the kingside. This repositioning might be a subtle signal that black is preparing to counterattack on the queenside or is seeking to avoid immediate complications in the center, opting instead for a more patient, maneuvering game. Unleashing a potent bishop with this placement targets the critical dark squares around black's castled monarch, preparing for potential central thrusts or an eventual kingside assault. Unleashing the knight from its passive guard of the kingside, this maneuver injects immediate central dynamism, challenging white's king's pawn control and potentially opening lines towards the enemy monarch through a well-timed f5 advance. Sacrificing the bishop here, white aims to shatter black's kingside pawn shield, potentially exposing the monarch to future attacks through the now open lines and creating weaknesses on dark squares. Unleashing the kingside attack hinges on this capture, immediately exposing black's monarch to a cascade of white pieces. Unleashing the queenside potential now, white immediately anchors the king to safety, preparing for a dynamic pawn storm or an assault along the newly opened queenside files. Intensifying pressure along the c-file, black mobilizes their rook to confront white's queenside pawn majority and potentially disrupt the king's safety. Securing the monarch becomes paramount now, as the king's escape route along the b1h7 diagonal is now definitively cleared, preventing any sneaky discoveries from black's queen or bishop. Sacrificing the rook on c3 rips open the c-file and creates immediate, dramatic threats against white's uncastled king, particularly aiming for the d2 queen and potentially harassing the king on the now exposed diagonal. Sacrificing material to seize the initiative and open lines against the enemy king is a bold strategy, and this recapture decisively embraces that aggressive posture. By eliminating black's knight and clearing the c-file, white is aiming for a swift attack, leveraging the queen's newfound activity and the open diagonal for the bishop. The exposed black king, now lacking its shield on the king side and potentially facing pressure along the center files, becomes a prime target, demanding constant vigilance and precise defensive maneuvers from black. Black boldly sacrifices a piece, aiming to disrupt white's queenside coordination and open up lines towards the exposed king. Opening the f-file offers immediate counterplay, aiming to disrupt black's queenside pawn majority and potentially harass the castled king, while the pawn on f3 also reinforces the central control and prevents a swift knight maneuver to e4. Seizing the open file offers a potent counterplay, sacrificing material for initiative and aiming to dismantle the opponent's king's safety with aggressive piece play. Reasserting control over the vital central files, the rook on h1 now stands ready to contest the open c-file and potentially swing over to the king side, aiming to exploit any lingering weaknesses around the black monarch. Reclaiming the material imbalance with the queen's sortie now brings black's monarch into a more exposed position, especially with the looming threat of white's rooks. Reclaiming the queen to a more active central square immediately looks to contest black's burgeoning queenside influence and prepare for potential attacks down the open c-file. Exploiting the bishop's diagonal, black aims to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure while simultaneously reinforcing the d-file's control. Initiating a bold foray to occupy the f-file, this rook activation aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially pin the knight, creating a dynamic imbalance. Black's bishop now occupies a truly commanding diagonal, eyeing white's vulnerable queenside and adding pressure to the center, a subtle yet powerful re-establishment of central influence after a period of maneuvering. Resuming the offensive pressure on the king side, this redeployment aims to connect the rooks and prepare for a potential pawn storm advance on the king side, leveraging the open lines created by black's structural weaknesses. A calculated risk, black repositions the central pawn to offer a seemingly passive defense while subtly preparing for an eventual queen's side expansion, leveraging the open e-file for future maneuverability. Unleashing the rooks, white intends to dominate the f-file, aiming to pressure the vulnerable black king and potentially open lines for further assault. This aggressive repositioning creates immediate tactical possibilities and forces black to react defensively, potentially sacrificing material or conceding positional advantages to avoid a swift mating attack. The strategic goal here is to isolate and exploit black's weakened kingside pawns, transforming the advantage into a decisive attack. By concentrating forces on the f-file, White seeks to disrupt black's defensive coordination and create critical weaknesses. The move creates a dynamic imbalance on the board, pushing black towards a reactive defense while white dictates the tempo and direction of the game. The rook's relocation to the center of the board aims to contest the open file and prepare for potential skirmishes, though it concedes the crucial central squares to white's attacking pieces and allows the pawn structure on the king side to remain vulnerable. Clearing the path for the king's rook offers a promising counter-strategy, aiming to exploit the open c-file and potentially create mating threats after repositioning the queen. The rook scurries to c4, not just to eye the queenside pawns, but to exploit the open c-file and apply pressure on white's disorganized kingside defense. Shifting the queen to e3 aims to reroute it towards the kingside or potentially support a central advance, while also freeing the f-file for further defensive or offensive maneuvers for the rook. Aimed at the queenside, this thrust seeks to reposition the queen to a more active post, potentially preparing to exploit the open c-file or support a future queenside pawn advance, while simultaneously probing white's somewhat cramped king position. Unleashing a knight to a central outpost, threatening to dismantle black's pawn shield around the king. Suddenly, the intricate dance of the queens concludes, forcing an immediate reassessment of the board's balance. The recapture firmly secures the central files for white, a crucial advantage as the game simplifies towards its endgame stages. This exchange, while seemingly simplifying, has fundamentally altered the pawn structure on the kingside, creating lasting weaknesses for black that can be exploited. Centralizing the knight here offers significant positional benefits, allowing it to potentially participate in attacks on either flank and contest crucial squares. Asserting control over the open c-file with this knight provides immense pressure and limits black's piece mobility. The newfound space gained by white will allow for easier piece maneuvering, and the potential for a decisive pawn storm in the later phases. The rook's journey to the fourth rank, a desperate attempt to find active squares amidst a constricted position, now faces the awkward reality of limited support, potentially becoming a target for white's consolidated forces. Reasserting pressure along the f-file, the rook aims to either support a future pawn advance or, more pressingly, challenge black's rook on the fourth rank and disrupt its current defensive setup. Sacrificing the rook on h3 initiates a desperate attempt to complicate matters and exploit white's potentially exposed king position, a bold gambit aimed at disrupting white's queenside pawn structure and creating tactical mayhem before the endgame solidifies. Exploiting the exposed king's position, white aims to seize control of the open queenside files and create penetration points. Introducing a new dimension of pawn pressure on the kingside, this defensive maneuver attempts to disrupt white's advancing structure by sacrificing a pawn to create a potential breakthrough, though it simultaneously weakens black's own king's shelter. Opening the long diagonal for the bishop and leveraging the open file is paramount now, creating immediate threats along the rank. Opening the queenside file with this capture offers a dynamic shift, allowing black's rook to finally engage on a more active path and challenge white's already doubled pawns. The rook embarks on an audacious journey, aiming to seize the open file and potentially disrupt black's pawn structure on the queenside. Instantly creating a fork, this knight boldly infiltrates the king's defenses, aiming to seize material and disrupt white's coordination. Embracing a bold, if somewhat risky, decision, white initiates a sequence aimed at simplifying the position and potentially creating passed pawns down the queenside. By capturing the knight, white intends to dismantle black's central pawn structure and establish greater control over the open files. This exchange, however, also opens up black's rook on the d-file, a tactical consideration that demands careful monitoring from white's perspective. The resulting pawn majority for black on the queenside presents a significant endgame challenge, requiring white to activate their pieces decisively to counter the potential breakthrough. A delightful discovery. Black, spotting an unexpected opportunity, seizes the initiative by unearthing a forgotten bishop and injecting immediate tactical complications into white's position. This move not only aims to recover the sacrificed pawn, but also creates a delightful fork on the king and rook, forcing white into a defensive posture and potentially disrupting their otherwise coordinated pieces. It's a testament to keeping all your pieces active, even those tucked away on the queen side, as they can suddenly become game changers. The monarch scurries away from the impending storm, prioritizing immediate safety over any pawn structure considerations. This capture on f1 is a desperate attempt to regain material imbalance, but it overlooks the exposed state of white's king. Black's initiative is now undeniable, with multiple pieces poised to exploit the open lines and white's disarray. The king's safety is paramount, and here, the cost of the pawn grab is simply too high, leaving the monarch vulnerable to a swift and decisive attack. Unleashing the knight to its central outpost after the exchange, white aims to exploit the slightly exposed black king and the potentially weak kingside pawns by initiating a coordinated attack with the remaining pieces. The rook now dances to its final outpost, threatening to swallow the undefended pawn on the kingside and forcing an immediate reevaluation of white's exposed monarch. Sacrificing the rook here opens up a desperate fight for the initiative, hoping to untangle the exposed king and perhaps create a passed pawn with the remaining pieces. A risky pawn grab that exposes the black king's immediate surroundings to severe pressure. Securing the king's safety becomes paramount as the rook retreats, creating a potential escape square and preparing to defend the vulnerable pawn chain. The bishop sacrifices itself, aiming to disrupt white's already precarious pawn structure and gain a tempo to potentially reroute the rook. The bishop on e3 attempts to secure white's precarious pawn on f3, a desperate bid to consolidate after a series of exchanges that have left the king exposed and the queenside structure compromised. The rook sacrifices itself, a desperate gambit to exploit the exposed white king and disrupt white's structure by eliminating a key defender. Unlocking the bishop's potential offers a decisive advantage, transforming a passive piece into an active attacker. The rook's foray onto the 7th rank, after the bishop's exchange, seems aimed at creating a sudden pocket of activity, hoping to capitalize on the exposed white king, but it opens a dangerous diagonal for the remaining white bishop, potentially leading to a swift counterattack. The bishop's final capture unwraps the lingering material imbalance, ushering in a straightforward endgame where white's king activity becomes paramount to outmaneuver the isolated opponent's pieces. A pawn's determined march down the wing, seeking to disrupt the king's guard and perhaps create a passed pawn, though its progress might be met with a swift defense. The king cautiously retreats to seek safety on the flank, aiming to support the pawns and prepare for any late-game action initiated by the opponent's active pieces. The pawn push up the kingside is an ambitious attempt to break open lines and create a passed pawn, but it potentially weakens your own king's shield and allows white's king to become active on the queen side. Exploring the newly opened diagonals and open files, the king ventures into potentially exposed territory, a risky proposition when the opponent's bishop still commands a crucial diagonal. The pawn push offers a desperate attempt to create a passed pawn, but it overlooks the immediate danger to its own king and the remaining weak pawns on the king side. The structure is now so fractured that it will struggle to achieve anything meaningful.